There are three major food outbreaks going on right now, and a big Salmonella one just led to 19 million eggs recalled at Kroger and other grocery stores. At the same time, two other food outbreaks are tearing across the country, with a tiny parasite, Cyclospora, that's on chopped lettuce, sickening thousands of people in more than 40 states. A new version of that's separate, is spreading and starting in my home state of North Carolina, this time on parsley and cilantro. Many different foods, multiple different germs. These are some of the biggest food outbreaks, happening at the same time. And I think the news is really behind the curve and covering these as separate stories. But what if they're not separate at all? What if the eggs in your refrigerator, the lettuce on your sandwich, and the parsley that's in your food are different chapters of the same exact story? And it's a story about what's flowing through our water. I talk to a lot of people out in the field, and that's one leading explanation I'm going to discuss today. I'm also working on a separate video on a totally different and interesting explanation that I'll release this week. And I think these are the things the news is not covering that could help you stay protected. Stay with me here because I think by the end of this video, you'll understand something that the headlines are skipping over. You'll know exactly how to keep the eggs in your kitchen from ever hurting the person that you might be caring for or your loved ones. And you'll be able to read the scary food safety news with a clear head instead of getting anxious. I think that's a real skill, and I hope you get it. 5 things you're going to learn in the next few minutes. 1, how a perfectly clean and uncracked egg can already be dangerous. And that's before, the shell even, hits your table. Why the germ called Salmonella has absolutely nothing to do with fish, and how the man who did the real scientific work actually got robbed of the credit. 3, whether human waste, and yes, I'm talking about human poop, can end up in your food. I think that's what's going on right now, and what 100 years of science actually says about how that happens. 4, the true story of a cook who never felt sick a single day in her life, and yet left a trail of death across New York, and why she might matter to your dinner tonight as we think about this story. And 5, the quiet change inside our food safety system that's happening over the last couple of years that very few people are talking about. And is that change responsible for whether or not these outbreaks are being caught, before they reach your table? So let's get right into it. I'm Neil K. Shah, a Johns Hopkins and NIH-funded caregiving researcher and the CEO of Caregiving. I've helped thousands of families navigate aging, dementia, and serious illness care. I'm not a clinician, but a leading researcher and innovator in caregiving. And I spend a lot of my days thinking about, food safety and how it affects older adults, because overall, I want to impact and inform the family members who are caring for them. So this is a major topic of mine for me right now. Before we go one step further, if you know someone who's caring for an aging parent or a spouse with serious illness, anyone whose body can't fight off, these major illnesses the way that it might have used to, share this video with them right now. Not later, but now, because I think a few minutes we could spend together could genuinely help someone that stay out of a hospital. That's the whole reason I record these. All right, so let's get to the eggs. Let's start with what actually happened and, get to the part that, no one's really explaining. A major egg producer just a couple days ago voluntarily recalled around 19 million eggs. Think about that, over Salmonella. Those eggs went out under store brands that you'd recognize, like Kroger and other retailers, sold across a bunch of states, and the recall date is here in late July. At the same time, a very different outbreak is not being caught early and is absolutely exploding. The microscopic parasite called Cyclospora, I've covered this recently in depth in my videos that have had millions of you watching. And if you haven't watched it, watch it next, has been found on, chopped iceberg lettuce and sickened, thousands of people across dozens of states. I think one state alone, Michigan, has reported several thousand cases in an area that normally sees a few dozen. So now we've got Salmonella on eggs, parasite on lettuce, and now on cilantro and parsley. The question I couldn't stop turning over is this just bad luck that they're all landing at the same time? Or is there a thread connecting them all that we might be looking right past? And to answer that, we have to go somewhere where food safety and food news never goes. We have to talk about where these germs actually come from. And I'll give you a heads up right now. It's not pretty. It's kind of gross, actually. But it's the truth. And knowing the truth can really protect you. Both of these germs come from the same place. They come from feces, poop that comes from the gut. Salmonella often lives in the intestines of animals and people. Cyclospora lives only in the human gut. The way both of them reach your plate is when that poop, whether it's from animal or human, finds a way into the food supply and directly onto your food. They're different germs, but the same exact path to getting on your food. Let me walk you through how it works with eggs and how even a clean and uncracked egg can already be dangerous. Many people picture this. The egg might get a little dirty on the outside, some germs sit on the shell, and if you're careless, they might get on your hands. That does happen, and scientists call that horizontal contamination. The germ gets on the shell from the hen's droppings in the barn, then works its way through the tiny pores in the shell. A hen house that's crawling with mice, flies, manure, it's already a germ factory, and we've seen that in past disasters. But there's a second way, and it's called vertical transmission. That's a fancy phrase for a simple and unsettling idea. If the hen herself is infected, then Salmonella can travel inside her body, into her ovaries, and get sealed inside the egg before the shell is even built around it. So then the germ is in the yolk or in the egg white from the very beginning. And if the shell is spotless and beautiful, the dangerous germ can already be locked inside. So that's why it looks fine on the outside of the egg, tells you actually nothing. And that's why, which we'll get into, cooking is your only real shield against this thing. And I'm talking about cooking fully both the egg white and the egg yolk. So sorry, folks, eating eggs over easy right now just would not be safe. The strong scientific evidence here is not in doubt, and it's well established and studied for decades. In fact, in one long stretch of American outbreaks, roughly 8 out of 10 Salmonella outbreaks with a known source were traced back to eggs. So eggs and this particular germ have a long and well-documented history together. Now, talking about that word Salmonella, where does it come from? And this surprises, almost everyone. Salmonella has nothing to do with salmon, the fish, even though it sounds the same, nothing. It's named after a man. His name was Daniel Elmer Salmon, and he was an American animal doctor in the late 1800s. I think one of the first people to earn a doctorate in veterinary medicine. And he ran a government lab studying diseases in farm animals. Interestingly enough, the man who did the actual hands-on discovery of this wasn't Salmon at all. It was his assistant, a brilliant young researcher named Theobald Smith. In 1885, Smith was the one at the microscope who first isolated this bacterium, pulled it from an infected pig. Smith did the work, but Salmon was the boss, the senior name on the paper, and the head of a lab. So later, when a French scientist gave the germ an official name, he named it Salmonella, after the boss of that lab. Interestingly, Theobald Smith, who found this, went on to become a great American scientist. But billions of people say the boss's name every single year and have never once heard of the man who actually found this. It's a small human reminder. I think that inside this giant public health story, credit doesn't always follow the work. Anyway, we have now established that both of these germs come from waste and that the egg danger can be hidden even inside the egg. So now let's get back to how does this spread? My question here is, can human waste, like human feces, actually end up as germs in or on your food? Salmonella spreads by what people call the fecal-oral route. Try not to wince as I describe its growth. It just means that tiny amounts of human poop, far too small to see, get from a gut to someone's mouth, usually by the way of hands, water, or food. And the waste can be an animal or from a person. So for everyday Salmonella, we're talking about animals often being the main source, but human beings absolutely can pass it on too. So how? 2 ways that can matter to you. First, the sick or not so obviously sick food handler. Someone who can work in a kitchen, uses a bathroom, doesn't wash their hands well, and touches the food. That's it. That's all it takes. And the part that unsettles people here is that you can keep shedding this germ in your waste for days, even weeks, after you actually feel completely better. So people may feel fine, go back to work, handling food, and they're still carrying it. Sick food handlers are one of the leading causes of outbreaks, such as in restaurants. And I think that's just kind of interesting to think about. Second, this ties everything together, the water. When human sewage isn't fully cleaned, it carries Salmonella in large amounts. And if that water reaches a field, whether it's through a runoff after a storm, an overflow, a leaking pipe, it can land on crops. This isn't just a theory. 20 years ago, a Salmonella outbreak tied to tomatoes was traced back to contaminated irrigation water. Salmonella outbreaks on cucumbers have sickened hundreds of people and were linked to the same kind of problem. Recently about 1/3 of all Salmonella outbreaks in America were connected to fresh produce, even fruits and vegetables. So it could be really in the irrigation water. Now sit with that. And this, I've heard this in Cyclospora too, a parasite could reach lettuce through water. Salmonella can reach all this stuff through same human waste in the water supply. These are potential identical methods of spread. And Here's another detail that should change how you think about just rinse it off. When crops have contaminated water, the germs don't always sit politely on the surface waiting to be washed away. Some can get pulled up into the plant itself. So a rinse, just under the tap won't reach them, which is why in the Cyclospora outbreak, washing produce can help, but it's never a guarantee. You have to cook everything fully to kill these. So just keep that in mind. I can't emphasize that enough. So back to these two outbreaks. Are the recalled eggs and the tainted lettuce the same source? Likely not, but are they the same kind of story running down the same kind of method of spread? Possibly. Both are waste reaching food through water, through poor conditions on a farm, through a break in basic sanitation. It's kind of a similar method of spread. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. Which brings me to an interesting story of a woman who understood this maybe a century before we had the science to explain it. The cook who never felt sick yet left a trail of death behind her. Her name was Mary Mallon. She was an Irish immigrant living in New York City in the early 1900s, and she worked as a cook for wealthy families. Unfortunately, wherever Mary cooked, people started getting sick with typhoid fever. That was a severe cousin in the Salmonella family. Household after household got sick. Some people even died. What made the case one of the most important in the history of medicine and food outbreaks is Mary Mallon was never sick, not once. She felt perfectly healthy, but her body carried the germs and shed it, and every time she handled food without knowing, she passed it along. A sanitation engineer named George Soper tracked the trail of illness back to her. It was the first time in America that people had proved that a healthy-looking person could silently spread disease through food. She later became infamous with her nickname Typhoid Mary. The city eventually forced her into quarantine, isolating her on a small island in the East River. And then they later let her out on one condition: never cook again. But cooking was how she made a living, so she just changed her name and went right back to the kitchen. And a fresh new outbreak followed, this time at a hospital, with more people sick and more people dead. Then they just confined her for the rest of her life, more than 2 decades. So was that fair? I don't know. Historians still argue about it. She was treated far more harshly than hundreds of other silent carriers who were never locked up. But it was a major case, and the lesson that she left into the public health is permanent, and that's sitting inside today's outbreaks. Sometimes the dangers you can't see are the ones that get you. In that case, it was a healthy-looking worker, clean-looking food. Today, it could be a rinse-looking, head of lettuce, but looks fine is not the same as safe. If this is helping you inform yourself, and if that helps you see these outbreaks differently than you did 5 minutes ago, that's exactly what we're here for. And please follow along and subscribe so the next time there's a scary headline, I'm happy to explain it for you, just plainly and honestly. And please share this with others. I hope people can get informed about this. So now let's get to the water. Because to really understand the pathway of spread, you have to understand something that farmers have often wrestled with for hundreds or even thousands of years. A truth that sounds modern but is ancient. For much of human history, we have fertilized our crops, oftentimes with our own waste. They even had a polite name for it called night soil. Farmers collected human waste from cities and spread it onto fields to feed the plants, and historically it worked. Unfortunately, it also spread disease constantly because many people in the past didn't understand germs yet. In the 1800s, a German chemist named Justus von Liebig, he's often called as the father of fertilizer, looked hard at this practice. And he first admired how carefully some of these societies had recycled human waste back into the soil and said it was a blessing that he thought Europe was wastefully throwing away. And Liebig launched the age of chemical fertilizer, which broke that ancient loop, and along with it, modern sewers. And it's one of the reasons that we don't drop dead from our dinner the way that our ancestors did. But today, treated human waste is often called biosolids, is sometimes spread on farmland as fertilizer. It's easy to sensationalize this, but the amount of American cropland treated this way is small. From what I've read, around 1% or so. And the treatment of it does knock the germ levels down. So I'm not saying that this is for sure the cause, but this is happening, and it's scary and something to think about. The rules on the testing usually test for only a couple of common germs, not for every parasite or virus. So it leads me to a question that is our monitoring system keeping up with the growth of this practice? I don't know. We have a new doorway now, waste in water and waste on the fields. We have proof it happens with both of these germs that are spreading. And, is there something unusual going on here? I think we need to be asking these questions. And now there's one more piece, and it's not about the farms at all, but it's about who's watching them. And there's a change in our food safety system that very few people are talking about. And I'm going to give it to you straight down the middle. I'm not a political person, but there are interesting documented facts here, and experts on many sides are saying the same thing. Over the past year or so, federal agencies that have historically infected our food, like FDA, even food safety arms of the USDA, have lost a large number of employees, sometimes numbering in the thousands. And it's not a rumor, it's in the government's own workforce records, and it has been reported across the board. Along the way, some senior food safety leaders either resigned or were let go. And there was a new rule that was designed to help investigators trace a tainted food back to the source quickly, the kind of rule that could shorten a food outbreak. That rule was pushed back by, about 2.5 years. So, the health departments have said that food safety inspectors themselves historically were largely protected, and most of these cuts, hit administrative and support roles, and that some layoffs were later reversed. So, there's two sides to the story here. And officials have said that the core disease tracking programs are still intact. So I'm reporting kind of both sides of the position. But there are also experts who are worried here. One infectious disease specialist put it, very simply, it can take 2 to 3 years to fully train a new food inspector. So even if everything was reversed quickly thereafter, there was a lot of lost experience that can take years to rebuild. A former head of the FDA said the agency as we knew it, with a deep bench of experienced people, has fundamentally changed now. And some government watchdogs have noted that, already for years, the FDA didn't have enough inspectors to check all the food facilities. Like in Cyclospora, the outbreaks have been growing now for 10 years plus. So some estimates have put the need for around 1,500 new inspectors. And that has been a case for years, and it's kind of across different administrations. But it makes you wonder, is the system that's supposed to catch the next outbreak thinner than it was years ago? The documented facts say yes, and I think people should be genuinely concerned. Which is why things like this new egg recall matter so much on top of the other, Cyclospora outbreak that's happening. I can't definitively say they came from the same source, but who is looking at what sources they came from? I think on top of all this, these are very difficult to trace back, but I just think the timing of these major outbreaks is quite surprising. And what I can tell you is the pattern. Both outbreaks are stories about waste reaching our food. Both run through the same weak points: water, waste, sanitation. Human waste is a proven, documented source of salmonella in produce. These aren't wild theories. These have paper trails going back decades. And, I think we need to really think about this. But let me turn to now the part that you can actually use tonight. If you're caring for an aging parent, someone with serious illness, someone whose body doesn't bounce back the way it used to, Salmonella isn't just like a 1 or 2 day nuisance for them, and neither is Cyclospora. In an older adult, it's far more likely to turn serious, to get into the bloodstream, to cause dehydration that can become dangerous, to land someone in the hospital. So I think, to me, this matters much more for our people than almost anyone else. And here's a simple, no-cost plan. None of this requires buying anything special or new. If you're eating eggs, cook eggs thoroughly until both the egg white and the egg yolk are firm. No runny yolks for a vulnerable person. If you're making something with a lot of eggs, like a casserole or a quiche, get it to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Just a cheap food thermometer is like the only tool you need, and it can remove all the guessing. For anything that uses raw or minimally cooked eggs, whether it's like homemade mayonnaise or eggnog or something like that, or even sometimes ice cream, use pasteurized eggs only. Pasteurized there just means that the eggs were gently heated to kill germs while they're still raw in the shell, and you'll see it marked on the carton. For an older or frail person, I think these are just simple, smart moves that you can make. If you're out there that's cooking in a care home, like a nursing home or assisted living community, or caring for someone who's going through cancer treatment, just skip soft or runny eggs entirely, and don't combine multiple eggs into a big batch unless they're pasteurized. Because if one bad egg gets in, it'll spread through the whole pot. For storage, keep eggs cold at or below 40 degrees, and don't let them or egg dishes sit out for more than a couple hours, or even 1 hour on a hot day. Buy things refrigerated, look and make sure you buy things with no cracks, and look out for trouble in people. If somebody spikes a fever over 102, diarrhea doesn't go away after a couple of days, blood in the stool, or signs of dehydration, just immediately call the doctor. Don't just wait and see. If you need help, there's the elder care locator, 1-800-677-1116, or 211 in your local community that can connect you to real resources for free. So I'll leave you with this. 100 years ago, a healthy-looking cook, washed her hands too quickly or not at all, and people, paid for it throughout neighborhoods across New York. That was Typhoid Mary. Today, this is happening in our water. Waste we can't see moving through fields, pipes, reaching a leaf of lettuce, parsley, hiding inside an egg. The germs change, but sometimes the doorway of transmission is the same. And the people who are hit the hardest are often our loved ones sitting across the kitchen table from us, our parents, our grandparents, the ones we're caring for. So we need to be careful and be vigilant ourselves. You now understand that hopefully better than you did before you watched the video. And do one thing that'll turn this understanding into protection. Please send this to someone else that cooks for a person they love, cooks for someone that's immunocompromised. That's how the risk gets stopped. Not by fear, but by informed people telling each other, share this and you might keep someone out of the hospital bed this week without even knowing that you did. I'm Neil K. Shah, and I hope you enjoyed this and found it informative, and I'll see you in the next one.